They came out of transit at 0412 station time, 43 vessels dropping into real space in a formation so precise it was almost ceremonial. The long-range grid lit up before their drives had even cooled. I was already in the command chair. 43 contacts, my sensor officer called. Transit signature matches the Ithran archival record. Origin vector, Velthari home cluster. Estimated transit duration, continuous fold, no waypoint stops. Weapons hot. I asked. Not yet. They're running scan protocols. Broad spectrum. Biological. Of course they were. They were looking for the silence they'd left behind. I pulled up the forward viewport feed. Through the transparent alloy, Earth hung below the station in its morning arc, the lights of the Verith megaplex burning gold across the eastern seaboard, the spine of the Calder warship assembly running 300 kilometers along the equatorial belt, the veil itself barely visible as a faint iridescent shimmer 60 kilometers above the cloud layer. From up here, in the dark, Earth looked like something that had been burning quietly for a very long time. Which was accurate. I opened a channel to Fleet Command, Orbital Tier. Commodore Vane, Ithran Watch Station. The Velthari are here. 43 vessels, transit fresh, running biological survey protocols. Request authorization to hold the perimeter line at 600,000 kilometers and do nothing else until they make contact. Fleet Admiral Osran's voice came back in 4 seconds. Authorization granted. Commodore. Full fleet holds position. They come to you. He didn't need to say what we both knew. This was exactly the scenario the watch stations had been built for. Every calculation, every orbital placement, every quiet century of preparation, it had all pointed to this specific morning. I told my crew to stand down to watch posture. Then I waited. It took the Velthari 11 minutes to notice the veil. I watched it happen on the scan feed. Their broad-spectrum biological sweep hit the veil's outer membrane and came back corrupted. The lattice absorbs and re-emits signal in a way that looks, to unfamiliar instruments, like a wall of living tissue. Which is not entirely inaccurate. The veil was grown, not built, from compounds derived in part from work our xenobiologists had done on what the Velthari themselves had seeded into our biosphere 80,000 years ago. Their formation tightened. 43 ships pulling inward. A defensive posture. Then they noticed the warships. I'll give them credit. Their discipline held for another 3 minutes after that. 3 minutes of silence while they tried to count hulls and run the numbers through whatever tactical calculus they were using. The Ithran Deep Fleet was not our entire order of battle. It was the portion we'd assigned to this engagement specifically because it was visible from their transit point. 112 warships in geosynchronous formation below the watch stations, engines cold, running lights on, making no move. We wanted them to see us clearly. Their lead vessel opened a channel at 0431. The translation engine on my board rendered the signal in under 2 seconds. Velthari is not a complex language for machines to handle. We'd had 80,000 years to study the traces they left. The voice that came through was deep and measured. Military. Command rank. Unknown station. This is the Reclamation Armada of the Velthari Propagation Authority. You are in contested space. Identify the governing body of this system and state your intention. Contested space. 80,000 years gone and they still called it that. I keyed my response. Reclamation Armada, this is Commodore Servain of the Ithran Deep Watch, Earth Orbital Defense, Coordinated Worlds of the Human Reach. You are at the threshold of sovereign human space. The system you have entered is not contested. It has been continuously inhabited, defended, and administered for the entirety of your absence. Please hold your current position. The reply took longer than light lag explained. They were talking among themselves. When the commander came back, something in the signal register had shifted. Still controlled, but different. Commodore Vane. The Velthari Propagation Authority seeded this system 81,400 years ago. Standard protocol requires a minimum of 100,000 years before reclamation. We have arrived ahead of schedule as a precautionary survey. The system should be uninhabited. Your presence here requires an explanation. I let the silence sit for a moment. Then I said, the explanation is that the drowning spore did not complete its work. Approximately 40% of the population at the time of seeding developed resistance. Their descendants are the people of Earth. There are currently 11 billion of us. We have been here the entire time. Another long pause. I watched my scan fade. 3 of their ships had begun quiet thruster adjustments. Not aggressive, but repositioning. Getting angles. Weapons are painting 3 of their vessels, my tactical officer said quietly. They don't know we are doing it. Keep it passive, I said. Don't lock. They didn't need to see a lock. What they needed to see, they were already seeing. The Velthari commander's voice, when it returned, had shed some of its formal register. There was something underneath now that the translation engine flagged as recalibration stress, the vocal equivalent of a mind rapidly revising a foundational assumption. You claim continuous habitation for 80,000 years. I don't claim it, I said. I'm telling you. Your own survey instruments are reading it. The veil you're scanning is a biologically derived atmospheric lattice. The megacities below it have been built and rebuilt across multiple geological cycles. The fleet you're looking at is a fraction of our standing order of battle. None of this is new. It has been here, growing, since before your propagation cycle even finished. There was a longer pause this time. I used it. I pulled up the archive packet my crew had prepared, the one the deep historians had spent 60 years compiling. Birth records from the early survivor communities, dating to within 2,000 years of the seeding event. Infrastructure survey data spanning the full 80 millennia. The geological record of human construction across every continent. Population curves from preceding estimates through the resistance emergence, the long climb back, and the reach expansion. I flagged it and queued it for transmission. I'm sending you a data packet, I said. It covers the complete documented history of human civilization on Earth, from before your seeding event through the present date. I'd recommend your analysts review the resistance emergence data specifically, sections 14 through 31 of the biological record. The drowning spore interacted with human immune architecture in ways your propagation models apparently didn't predict. The survivors didn't just resist. They adapted. Their descendants have been building on that adaptation for 80,000 years. I transmitted the packet. Then I waited again. It took them 40 minutes to get back to me. 40 minutes during which I watched their formation hold absolutely still, which told me the discipline aboard those ships was exceptional, because what they were reading in that packet must have been working on them like a slow tide coming in. At the 18-minute mark, one of their vessels changed its sensor array configuration. My electronic intelligence officer flagged it immediately. They've switched to deep geological scan, she said. They're reading the continental infrastructure layers. Not just the surface builds, they're going down, looking at the old stuff. How deep? They are pulling stratigraphy, 40,000-year urban deposit layers. They're counting the build cycles. Of course they were. Numbers you can argue with. Geology you cannot. The deep city layers beneath Verith and the Calder Coast and the eastern basin settlements had been accumulating since before the Velthari's own propagation authority had finished drafting the seeding order. Stone on stone on stone, 40,000 years of people who refused to stop building. Their instruments were reading it the way you read a wound, layer by layer, trying to understand the depth of it. At the 31st minute, a second vessel began running atmospheric sample analysis on the veil. I watched the return signatures on my board. They were finding exactly what we'd told them they'd find. The spore's own compounds, restructured, grown into something planetary in scale. They've queried the transmission twice, my communications officer said, pulling sections 14 through 22 again. The resistance emergence data. Let them pull it as many times as they need. I leaned back in the command chair and looked at the planet below. The Calder warship spine caught the morning sun along its full length, 300 kilometers of lit hull, dozens of vessels in various stages of completion visible even from this altitude. The Ithran Deep Fleet, the 112 hulls we'd parked for this morning, was only a portion of what that spine had produced in the last 4 centuries. The Velthari instruments, if they were any good, would be working that out too. When the commander spoke again, the formal register was almost entirely gone. Commodore, the data you have transmitted is a pause, a long one. The resistance rate your records indicate is not consistent with propagation authority models. The seeding was rated at 94.7% effectiveness. Yes, I said. We know. We found the original survey documentation in our deep archives approximately 12,000 years ago. Your effectiveness rating was based on the assumption that human immune response would behave as a closed system. It doesn't. It learns. The The population that survived the initial seeding phase passed modified immune architecture to every subsequent generation. By the time your seeding cycle would have been considered complete, the resistance rate in the population was effectively total. Silence. The veil, the commander said. The atmospheric lattice. Grown from compounds derived from the spore itself, I said. We spent about 6,000 years studying what you sent us before we understood it well enough to do that. It took another 4,000 to scale it to planetary coverage. It's been in place for approximately 70,000 years. Nothing biological enters this atmosphere without our knowledge and consent. The silence that followed that was different from the others. Longer. Denser. I thought about what that packet was doing to them. 80,000 years of meticulous human memory, compressed into a data stream and handed to the people who had tried to erase us. The birth records of the first resistance communities, kept in stone and clay because they hadn't rebuilt writing yet, but they still kept records, because we have always kept records. The first orbital platforms, crude and fragile, launched 11,000 years ago. The first warships, 6,000 years after that. The Veil's construction logs. The founding charter of the watch stations, written 900 years ago by people who had studied the transit coordinate record and calculated exactly when this morning would arrive. 900 years ago, we had known they were coming. We had built the stations specifically to be here when they arrived. Not because we wanted a war. Because we wanted this conversation to happen from a position of clarity. Commodore Vane. The commander's voice, when it finally returned, was very quiet. The propagation authority will need to convene a review. What you have transmitted, the scale of what you have built, this was not anticipated. No, I said. It wasn't. That's the nature of 80,000 years. Things change. Another pause. Then, what are your intentions? I had thought about this question for a long time. Not me personally. I had thought about it for perhaps 3 years, since I took command of the station. But the people who wrote the watch station charter had thought about it for much longer, and their answer was the one I carried. Our intention is to exist, I said. We have been doing that for 80,000 years and we intend to continue. We don't hold what was done to us against the Velthari who are alive today. You weren't there, and neither were the people it happened to. What we hold is the memory. We keep it because it tells us something important about the shape of the galaxy and the kind of preparation a people needs to survive in it. I let that settle. Then I said, the propagation authority should understand one thing clearly before your review convenes. We have identified 47 other systems in your historical seeding records that we believe contain populations who survived, as we did, and who have had time to develop. We haven't made contact with all of them. But we've been watching. If any of those systems receives a reclamation armada before their people have the standing to receive it on their own terms, we will be present for that conversation as well. The channel stayed open for a long time after that. Long enough that I began to wonder if the commander had simply stepped away from his board. Then he said, very quietly, "Understood, Commodore." I closed the channel. Below the station, the Earth turned in the morning light. The Verith megaplex was coming into full sunrise now, all that gold turning to white. The Ithran Deep Fleet held its position below me, 112 hulls running lights burning steady, none of them having fired a single weapon this morning. None of them needing to. That was the part that the old records had always been clear about, even the earliest ones. Even the clay tablets from the resistance communities scratched out by people who were still sick and still burying their dead and still, somehow, still thinking ahead. They hadn't written about revenge. They hadn't written about what they would do when the ones who sent the spore came back. They had written about survival, about the long work of it, about what it cost and what it required and what a people had to become in order to still be standing when the next challenge arrived. We had become that. Somewhere in the deep archives beneath the Verith megaplex, in a climate-controlled chamber that had been maintained without interruption for 12,000 years, there was a clay tablet from one of the first resistance communities. The archaeologists had translated it a long time ago. It was a record of births and deaths from the generation that had survived the seeding. At the bottom, in the cramped notation of the period, someone had added a single line that the translators had argued about for a decade before agreeing on the rendering. It said, "We are still here. Remember this. Keep the count." We had kept the count. We were still here.